Chapter 3 The Dragon Who Didn't Do His Homework. Jordan Peterson has a dark vision. Freedom itself, the inheritance of the Western world, is under threat from neo-Marxism and the tyranny of collectivism. Hordes of college students demand gender recognition and express concern over inequality and the environmental crisis when they should be disciplining themselves, or at least tweeting in defense of their intellectual guru. The preoccupations with gender, savvy use of social media, and the advice to stand up straight and clean your room launched Jordan Peterson into the stratosphere in 2017 and 2018. This is not to say that literally cleaning your room is a bad idea, and 10 of his 12 rules amount to good advice. Rule 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Rule 2, treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. Rule 3, make friends with people who want the best for you. Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Rule 8, tell the truth or at least don't lie. Rule 9, assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. Rule 10, be precise in your speech. Rule 11, do not bother children when they are skateboarding. Rule 12, pet a cat when you see one in your street. The exceptions are Rule 5, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them, which has an authoritarian ring to it, and most especially Rule 6, which is a strong example of Peterson allowing his right-leaning politics to bleed into his life advice, and which simply states, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. The problem, as Slavoj Žižek pointed out to Peterson in their debate, is that sometimes people's houses aren't in order precisely because of the condition of the world. As we'll see, this is the central contradiction in Peterson's worldview. On the one hand, he's a cultural conservative, bemoaning disorder and social atomization. On the other hand, he's an uncritical apologist for the free market system that generates the very conditions he laments, as predictably as a boiling tea kettle generates steam. Peterson himself could do a better job of following Rule 10, be precise in your speech. Here he is being imprecise in 12 rules for life. There are now whole disciplines in universities forthrightly hostile to men. These are areas of study dominated by the postmodern neo-Marxist claim that Western culture, in particular, is an oppressive structure created by white men to dominate and exclude women and other select groups, successful only because of that domination and exclusion. Any reader who knows anything about any of these subjects should wonder what any of this has to do with either Marxism, neo or otherwise, or postmodernism. Marxism doesn't explain gender oppression or anything else in terms of bad people designing structures with the conscious intention of screwing over people who are unlike them. Instead, Marx and Engels offer an analysis of such structures that's rooted in an economic and social analysis of the social relations that constitute and produce our material conditions. Postmodernism, meanwhile, is a school of thought that developed in rebellion against grand narratives about history and society, grand narratives like Marxism, and which argues there's no such thing as a stable truth. While many people have tried to point this out to Peterson in the last few years, he continues to violate Rule 10 and Rule 9, assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't, as he conflates Marxism and postmodernism in a wildly imprecise way. In the years since he wrote that passage, Peterson has become even more slippery in his analysis. He often drops the comparison and sometimes even the neo in postmodern neo-Marxist. He incoherently talks of postmodern Marxism. In a video entitled The Fatal Flaw in American Leftist Politics, Peterson goes so far as to claim that French intellectuals like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, who had been Marxists and indeed student revolutionaries in 1968, pulled off a sleight of hand and transformed Marxism into postmodern identity politics in the late 1960s, when revelations about how bad the Soviet Union was made it impossible to be a thinking and conscious person and to be a Marxist. This is embarrassing and historically illiterate. The most important revelations about the ugly realities of the Soviet Union came in Khrushchev's speech to the 20th Party Congress in 1956, when the Soviet leader lambasted both Stalin and Stalinism. Khrushchev's denunciations, combined with the Soviet invasion of Hungary later that year, led to mass defections from communist parties all around the world. No particularly new information about the Soviet Union or China came out in the late 1960s, though, and when what had happened in Hungary in 1956 repeated itself in Czechoslovakia in 1968, with Soviet tanks rolling into Prague to crush another experiment in building a more humane and democratic form of socialism, it led communist parties in Western Europe to distance themselves from the Soviet Union and drift toward what would become Euro-communism. Meanwhile, a number of prominent Marxist intellectuals, including Jean-Paul Sartre, had long maintained their independence from the Communist Party. In fact, Sartre wrote a book in 1956 denouncing the Soviet invasion of Hungary, though this didn't mean he stopped being a Marxist. The idea that there were Marxist intellectuals and movements that consciously separated themselves from the Soviet Union, its brutalities, and its associated parties doesn't seem to have occurred to Peterson as a possibility. This might be why he didn't notice that the Communist Party of France was actually opposed to the uprising of French workers and students in 1968. Marxist student revolutionaries who participated anyway were by definition independent of the Communist Party of France and its pro-Soviet party line. Meanwhile, Peterson gets a number of his facts wrong. To take one example, Foucault, far from being a protesting student in 1968, was by then a well-established intellectual in his 40s. His first major book, Madness and Civilization, an important text in the development of postmodernism, was published in 1960. Similarly, Derrida's Of Grammatology came out in 1967, when the scholar was in his late 30s. Peterson's cartoonishly conspiratorial story about the relationship between Marxism and postmodernism could hardly be less accurate. In 1966, Sartre called Foucault the last barricade the bourgeoisie can still erect against Marx. Foucault returned fire, joking, "Poor bourgeoisie, if they need me as a barricade, they have already lost power." That's funny, but the more we look at Foucault's political development, the more it seems like Sartre may have had a point. In an interview with the French journal Ballast, translated into English for Jacobin by Seth Ackerman, Daniel Zamora talks about how Foucault was highly attracted to economic liberalism in his later life, seeing in it a much less bureaucratic and much less disciplinarian form of politics than that offered by the socialist and communist left, which he saw as obsolete. There's also the question of what any of this has to do with identity politics. Postmodernism is all about focusing on the particular in order to deconstruct totalizing narratives. Feminists seeking greater gender equality, or trans activists working for equal rights and dignity, necessarily focus on more general categories. And unlike postmodernists, they have specifically political aims. Nevertheless, Peterson's obsession with what he sees as the totalitarian Marxist aims of postmodern identity politics has defined his public career. Hardly anyone read his first book, Maps of Meaning, a dense tome that often reads like a psychedelic collaboration between Carl Jung and L. Ron Hubbard. 12 Rules for Life stood out on shelves already full of similar self-help advice books because Peterson had become famous for his viral YouTube videos that warn of the threat political correctness poses to Western civilization. Specifically, it was Peterson's concerns about Bill C-16, an act to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code, which made him internet famous. Peterson claimed that the bill was a compelled speech law under which he could be legally penalised for failing to use trans students' preferred pronouns. Here are several examples of criticisms he made during his crusade. I've studied authoritarianism for a very long time, for 40 years, and they're started by people's attempts to control the ideological and linguistic territory. There's no way I'm going to use words made up by people who are doing that. Not a chance. There's only two alternatives. One is silent slavery with all the repression and resentment that will generate, and the other is outright conflict. Free speech is not just another value, it's the foundation of Western civilization. These laws are the first laws that I've seen that require people under the threat of legal punishment to employ certain words, to speak a certain way, instead of merely limiting what they're allowed to say. I can envision a student or a colleague insisting that I call them using gender-neutral pronouns, she or ze. I think that those gender-neutral pronouns are connected to an entire underground apparatus of political motivations. I think that uttering those words makes me a tool of those motivations, the mouthpiece of a murderous ideology. In liberal democratic societies, there are often competing interests and even conflicting rights. Since Bill 16 has passed, no one in Canada has been fined for using the wrong pronoun. Just how a potential conflict between the Human Rights Code and Section 2 of the Canadian Constitution, the section establishing the right to free expression, will be worked out in the courts remains to be seen. What is immediately obvious, however, is that Peterson's claim that Bill C-16 amounts to an attempt to use an underground apparatus, an apparatus apparently built by a group of malicious neo-Marxists, to enforce a chaotic and resentful ideology and destroy the West, is not just imprecise but unhinged. Bill C-16 is, like any other attempt to establish and protect human rights, a product of the liberal and democratic principles that Peterson would associate with the West. Peterson's battle with what he imagines to be the agenda of the radical left simply can't be taken seriously, especially when you consider his self-confessed ignorance. At the beginning of his debate with Zizek, Peterson made the shocking admission that, despite the fact that he has built his fame by decrying the dangers of something he calls Marxism, prior to his preparation for the debate, he hadn't reread the Communist Manifesto since he was 18 years old. If he hadn't felt moved to pick up Marx's shortest and most popular book at any point in the last few decades, and to put this into perspective, there are editions of the manifesto that are padded out with multiple prefaces, introductions, and explanatory essays that still manage to be thinner than the book you're reading now, it's safe to say Peterson hasn't been poring over the 3 volumes of Capital. Even when it comes to the Communist Manifesto, he seems to have missed Marx's and Engels' point by a mile. In his debate with Zizek, Peterson claimed that even Marx admits in the manifesto that capitalism is the most productive economic system that has ever existed. Benjamin Studebaker sets him straight on this point in an article in Current Affairs. This is the point in the talk where Peterson most clearly reveals his lack of engagement with the content of Marx's theory of history. Marx thinks that each economic system is the most productive in history when first introduced, but that eventually each outlives its usefulness and is replaced by something more appropriate to the technology of the time. That Peterson has a shaky grasp on history and Marxist theory is to be expected. As I've been saying throughout this book, the Petersons of the world want to naturalise or mythologise the injustices we see around us instead of analysing them as a function of historical processes that, because they are human-made, can be rectified in the future. Unsurprisingly, given his adherence to Jungian psychology, Peterson's particular specialty is mythologising. For example, instead of just saying that feminists or trans activists are a threat to traditional values, he'll go on and on about defending capital O order against the dragon of chaos. Similarly, he likes to accuse those who desire an equality of outcome of having an incomplete view of the world, because they see social systems through the mythic archetype of the tyrant, without understanding that the latter is forever bound together with the archetype of the wise king. Peterson also does plenty of naturalising. In fact, he's so fond of it that you can see him on YouTube declaring that I'm an evolutionary biologist, even though he holds no degrees in this field. One of his favourite arguments is that the radical left is foolish for trying to transcend hierarchy, given that even lobsters have hierarchies. The argument goes like this: given how long ago the ancestors of humans and lobsters diverged, a tendency to arrange ourselves into dominance hierarchies must be etched deep into our biology. This is a completely vacuous assertion that could be used to defend any hierarchical system at any point in history. In antebellum, Jordan Peterson could have used it to defend the hierarchy of slaves and plantation owners, and in fact many did affirm that slavery was natural and evident in such important texts as the Bible. An 18th century Peterson could have used it to defend the hierarchy of kings, lords and commons. Meanwhile, no one really suggests that literally all forms of social interaction that could be described as hierarchical are problematic. I've been a socialist for a long time now, and I've never once heard anyone claim that parents and toddlers should have a completely equal say on matters such as bedtime and wandering into traffic. And for that matter, I don't want each NBA team to take turns winning a championship. The question is whether any particular hierarchy is justified, and if not, whether and how we can get rid of it. Putting aside Peterson's arguments about hierarchy in general, we should ask whether the hierarchical structure of capitalist businesses can or should be changed. To answer that question, we must move away from bizarre Aesopian fables and take a look at the real world. The Mondragon Corporation is both a worker-owned cooperative and one of the most successful businesses in Spain. The Marxist economist Richard Wolff visited Mondragon in 2012, and here's what he reported. Given that MC has 85,000 members, its pay equity rules can and do contribute to a larger society with far greater income and wealth equality than is typical in societies that have chosen capitalist organisations of enterprises. Over 43% of MC members are women, whose equal powers with male members likewise influence gender relations in society different from capitalist enterprises. MC displays a commitment to job security I have rarely encountered in capitalist enterprises. It operates across as well as within particular cooperative enterprises. MC members created a system to move workers from enterprises needing fewer to those needing more workers, in a remarkably open, transparent, rule-governed way, and with associated travel and other subsidies to minimise hardship. This security-focused system has transformed the lives of workers, their families and communities, also in unique ways. Wolff emphasises that Mondragon is not a utopia. It's a work in progress with problems and limitations and internal contradictions to be overcome. It's hard to deny, though, that its considerable success demonstrates that the rigid economic hierarchies that emerge from the separation of labour and ownership can be transcended without this leading to economic collapse or famine or the dragon of chaos terrorising the countryside. I could keep going in this vein, but dealing with Peterson adequately requires more than just listing off the many things he gets wrong or highlighting his dangerous contradictions. For example, obsessing about freedom while getting chummy with authoritarians like Viktor Orban. An adequate left response to him must involve a much more focused and even empathetic look at the real cultural crisis to which he is speaking and which has led many sad young men to turn to him for comfort. In capitalism, human beings are alienated, and the young and mostly, but not all, white men that Peterson speaks to are no exception. The shifting demands of work, technology and the economy have left many feeling confused and adrift, including some of those succeeding in the emerging paradigm. At this point, one should ask whether working 90 hours a week to destroy the climate for Goldman Sachs is a success in any meaningful way. Peterson is the perfect guru in the sense that his highly emotional, pop culture friendly and middle-brow intellectualism, which is grounded in appeals to an imagined past, provides a perfect objective focus for this frustration. His style of communication is purely of the now, and the conservative currents he embodies have the perfect bedtime story appeal. They provide a clear yet individualistic and capitalistic path forward for the alienated young man. One of the most dangerous things the left can do is to write off the demographic to which Peterson appeals because of its relative racial and gender privilege. For one thing, setting aside all else, young and angry white men have historically been a pretty dangerous group. They're the subset of the population most likely to become school shooters or join fascist movements. Far better that someone addresses their alienation in a constructive way and channels their justified frustration in a positive direction. Analysing Peterson's shaky assertions, sloppy and eccentric thinking, and disturbing generalisations is important, However, this critique clearly does address the core emotional and psychological needs that he is speaking to as a public figure. Like everyone else, young white men are trying to muddle through life in a relentlessly complicated, unequal and, to use one of Peterson's favourite terms, chaotic era. All the IDW and IDW adjacent figures mentioned in this book are spreading narratives that soothe general anxieties by smoothing over the complications of real life. It's easy to make lobster, crying and cider jokes, and I'm certainly not above that. See the cider story with Joe Rogan video. Seriously, watch it. Oh my god, that was amazing. But we need to develop a deeper response than that. The cosmopolitan socialist synthesis that I'm arguing for aims to deal head-on with the anxieties, pain and confusion that Peterson evokes. To begin framing the left's response, one must appreciate the degree to which Peterson is taking on the biggest macro issues of our time and trying to solve them with the smallest self-help micro solutions. Socialists can do better. We can start by analysing the material roots of the uptick in alienation and despair that fuels Peterson's book sales. That doesn't mean telling people not to care about spiritual fulfillment or personal meaning. It's not an either-or. What we should point out, though, is that increasing numbers of younger people in our late-stage capitalist economy are pushed into forms of precarious freelance pseudo-entrepreneurship. People aren't having trouble maintaining relationships or waiting longer to have children because of Marxism or feminism or the existence of trans people. They're having trouble maintaining relationships or waiting longer to have children because they live lives defined by relentless anxiety and undercompensation. The loss of stability experienced by so-called millennials and zoomers, moreover, hasn't even been compensated by a meaningful increase in autonomy. Whether you're employed by General Motors or Uber, workplaces at the end of the second decade of the 21st century remain sites of autocracy. The example of Mondragon suggests that there's a better way. Peterson claims to cherish the Western tradition, but he has no interest in applying the best of that tradition, the Enlightenment concepts of democracy and self-determination, to the workplace. Instead of asking people to simply clean their rooms while everything burns down around them, socialists must reimagine the oppressive and alienating systems that structure both the boardroom and the shop floor. What about the issues of meaning and purpose that Peterson constantly evokes? I have no doubt that his willingness to speak so frankly to such fundamental parts of our lives is inseparable from his broader appeal. Again, though Peterson's approach is lacking, the themes he's dealing with should not be dismissed but should be addressed in more integrated and sound ways. The work of anthropologist Scott Atran and depth psychologist James Hillman provide potent contrast to Peterson's mythology-enhanced market fundamentalism. Unlike Peterson's Drek, Atran's ethnographic research on terrorism has actually been used in real-world situations, and not just in thought experiments and podcasts. Namely, what is done is connect the rise and discourses of both jihadism and the alt-right to the alienation and lack of shared purpose endemic to hyper-consumerist societies like the United States of America and Saudi Arabia. Consideration of this point leads us right back to the core contradiction in Peterson. Though he affirms that he's deeply disturbed by the alienation, fragmentation and disruption of cultural continuity brought about by late capitalism, he nevertheless expresses an enthusiastic commitment to free markets. This leaves him without any mode of response more useful than an addled combination of conspiracy theories and self-help advice about lobsters and chaotic women. While I don't agree with Atran about everything, he approaches the problem of male alienation from the correct starting point, recognizing that fostering sacred meaning and group bonds in liberal market societies is a defining challenge of our era. Indeed, this is a challenge that international socialists should take up as they work to transform society. If you're interested in contemporary Jungian psychology, you can do much better than Peterson. James Hillman is an archetypal psychologist who actually ran the Jung Institute in Vienna at one point in his career. He went on to co-author a brilliant book in the 1990s entitled "We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World is Getting Worse," that offered a number of incisive points about modern-day alienation. We've had 100 years of analysis and people are getting more and more sensitive and the world is getting worse and worse. Maybe it's time to look at that. We still locate the psyche inside the skin. We go inside to locate the psyche. You examine your feelings and your dreams. They belong to you. Or its interrelations, interpsyche, between your psyche and mine. That's been extended a little bit into family systems and office groups. But the psyche, the soul, is still only within and between people. We're working on our relationships constantly and our feelings and reflections, but look what's left out of that. What's left out is a deteriorating world. I feel comfortable with Hillman's arguments about mythology, archetypes, dreams, and spirituality because his analysis of these subjects is connected to a seriously grounded materialist understanding of how social and group practices form and influence psychological health. In an interview entitled "You're Not Paranoid, the Boss Really Is Out to Get You," Hillman used everything from air pollution to homelessness as potent examples of problems that should in fact cause us psychic anguish, that psychology with its focus on the self will not solve. Though Hillman never denied the role individual development, psychological maturation, and spiritual growth play in making a person content, he understood that a pained response is often a natural response to a shockingly unequal and ecologically poisoned world. Hillman's wasn't a bedtime story, but a real challenge to reorient ourselves to face the dissociations and collective trauma we are constantly causing and with which we are constantly dealing. Both Hillman and my own mentor Susan Green, a strategist whose work and analytic insight has helped me greatly, also deal in ambiguity and in discerning underlying dynamics and challenges instead of rigid and linear readings and interpretations of mythological texts. Peterson's artificial division between market mythology and reactionary conservatism will ultimately doom his project intellectually. Tragically, as a self-help source for confused and alienated people, he will likely continue to find a ready market for his wares unless we provide something more compelling. Wolf, Atran, and Hillman offer us a useful start, but it will be up to us to do the work.